How's everyone doing this morning? Amateur sound crew up there letting me down. So, they're awake, but there we go. There we go. So, all right. Good to see everyone this morning. So, Brother Hollis, you would have been entertained yesterday. I went over to the camp yesterday morning. Brother Jamie asked me to take the fan out of the bathroom, and I didn't realize that you had cut the commode loose in the bathroom, and I needed to step up on something. When I stepped on that thing flipped sideways on me. Yeah, it was an adventure for about 2 seconds right there, because I didn't realize that Brother Hollis had already cut it loose, and it tilted on me, and I about fell down. So I went and found me a bucket to stand on after that. But it was pretty funny. It was pretty funny, but I was the only one that got to enjoy it. So anyway, that's gonna look nice once they get it done. Brother Hollis and Brother Jamie and them working hard, tearing out the whole back end of the camp. That's gonna really look nice once they get that all tore out and then rebuilt. That's gonna be nice. So if you have your Bible, turned back to 2 Samuel chapter number 12. 2 Samuel chapter number 12, and so for those of you who were here last week, you know where we were at, but those of you who are absent, we were talking about the beauty of Bathsheba. I read that in chapter number 11, that in verse number 2 it says, "And the woman was very beautiful to look upon." And then I read the verses where over in Ephesians talking about forgiveness. And in my mind, in my opinion, that is Bathsheba's greatest attribute is forgiveness and just getting over things and moving on. Just getting over things and moving on. And sometimes that's some of the hardest thing you'll ever do is forgive and get over it and move on. For those of you who if you've never been done wrong, then congratulations. But for most people, for most of us, we've been done wrong. Somebody's done something to us. Somebody's accused us of something that wasn't true. Somebody said something about us that wasn't true. Somebody that you thought you could trust turned around, stabbed you in the back. All of us have had those experiences. And my wife and mother-in-law were talking about it this morning. I think my mother-in-law mentioned it this morning. We were talking about some other things, but she said, these things that come up in your life, they either make you bitter or they make you better. They either make you bitter or they make you better, and that's kind of a cliche, but that's the honest truth. That is the honest truth. You have to choose. We were talking about kids and things like that, and I told my mother-in-law, I said, look, there comes a point in time in every young person's life where they become an adult. And once they become an adult, they can choose to follow how you raised them. They can choose to follow after God. They can choose to go turn away from God. But that's on them. That's not on you. They make that choice. They make that choice. And the same thing with when things happen to you. Do you either choose that I'm going to be bitter over this, or I'm going to get over it and I'm going to be better because of it? And so we talked about last week how that David, the first person that Bathsheba had to forgive was David himself. And we talked about last week how David had shattered Bathsheba's image of David. And so we went down through and we talked about how back in the day the women of Israel chanted, Saul had slain his thousands, but David his 10,000s. And we know that the Bible calls that David was a man after God's own heart. And we talked about how she saw David through the eyes of Ahithophel. and through the eyes of Eliam and through the eyes of Uriah. And so she had this image of who she thought David was. And in one instance of time, David destroyed all of that with Bathsheba. In just one moment when David was not right with God, not being right with God, and his heart was full of lust, that he destroyed that image that Bathsheba had of David. And so I mentioned last week how that she saw him at his worst. She saw him at his worst. Like I said, I mean, no one else had ever seen David like this. No one else had ever seen David. And again, like I said, the Bible talks about how that he was a man after God's own heart. And the only thing that God held against him was the matter of Uriah the Hittite. And so she saw, like I said, she saw him at his worst, and we went down through a few things of what she had to endure because of David, and how that David tried to after he committed adultery with her, and how that she sent and said, "Hey, I'm with child," and how David tried to scheme to cover up for his sin, and basically tried to make her an accomplice in covering up for his sin. And so then he had her husband killed, and then at the end of chapter number 11, and verse number 27 says, "When the morning was past, David sent and fetched her to his house, and she became his wife." And so we know that he just waited for her to get over mourning, and that mourning right there, that mourning is not just like, oh, there's a little time that she had to recover. That mourning means like she was weeping and wailing. It wasn't just that, it wasn't just, hey, there's a certain time frame that I should give her, and then as soon as that time frame's over. No, she was weeping and wailing over the fact that her husband was slain. And she knew why her husband was slain. Whether she knew everything at the beginning, but she knew her husband was slain because David was covering up their sin. And then for all those months between that time frame after he married her until Nathan comes, here's Bathsheba, and she's now married to this man, but David was again at his worst state because he was not right with God at this time. He was not right with God. And so then, the child becomes sick. The child becomes sick, and that's what we're going to start with this morning. The child becomes sick, and I wrote this down, that in Bathsheba's greatest hour of need, David was absent. Now you think about this, and we understand the whole story. We understand the whole story that Nathan the prophet had went and talked to David and told David that the child was going to die, and then whenever the child becomes sick, David, instead of going and comforting Bathsheba and explaining to her, hey, this is what God said, this is what's going to happen, we know that David goes and he prays and he fasts and he prays and he waits until after the child dies before he gets up. So it's after the child dies before he gets up. And so you think about that. In his wife's greatest hour of need, David was not there. Now again, like I said, we understand the context and we understand what he was doing, but Brother Croft, if you think about everything, and I heard this many years ago, many years ago. I don't even remember who said it, but they talked about how life is it's a lot like a trash can, and if you have to empty that trash can, or it's going to overflow. You hear that, Grady? You have to empty the trash can, or it's going to overflow. And so that marriage is like that. If you keep putting in the bad, and you never take it out and empty it, eventually it just overflows. If you think about in Bathsheba and David's relationship, it's been bad, and now at the very worst moment, because now she's had the child, and we've talked about this before, but again, as a man, I talked about when a woman has a miscarriage, as a man, you haven't bonded with that child yet. And as a man, when a child it's a little bitty baby, you hold it for the first time, but it takes time for you and that child to bond. where that child and their mother, I mean, that baby has listened to its mother's heartbeat for 9 months. That baby's listened to its mother's heartbeat. So a lot of times a father can't console the child, but a mom, all she has to do is just lay it up on her chest, and that child hears that mother's heartbeat, and it can console a child. And so here Bathsheba has already bonded with this child, even though it's only just a couple days old. She's already bonded with this child, and this child is sick, and she's losing the child. And her husband, who's the whole reason why she had this illegitimate child, is nowhere to be found. And so in her greatest moment of need, David was nowhere to be found. And again, like I said, now we understand the context. We understand the context. But to a woman that all she's ever experienced is bad, 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 and bad, a lot of times they don't want to know the context. All they know is you should have been here, and you weren't here. And why weren't you here? Well, you already knew you couldn't do anything for the child. You already knew the child was going to die. God already told you the child was going to die, and you should have been here at least for me. You should have at least been here for me, and you weren't here for me. And so he was not there in her greatest hour of need. One of the other things that David shattered, and we're gonna kind of go back here, but David shattered Bathsheba's dream of living happily ever after with her husband. I mean, you think about it, and again, I mean, you think about it, that here, and I know we're going backwards here, but here is Bathsheba, and she's married to Uriah, and what does every woman want? They just, I mean, that's why Disney became so popular. They're not popular anymore because they lost their way. Or they're not as popular anymore, but they lost their way. But I mean, back when I was a kid, Disney was very popular. Why? Because, they had these stories, and they told these wonderful stories, and they let your imagination run wild, but always at the end, someone lived happily ever after. And so every girl grows up in her mind of getting married and living happily ever after. And no doubt when Bathsheba and Uriah were married, that was her dream, was to live happily ever after with Uriah. And David destroyed that. He destroyed that. And he also destroyed the opportunity for her of having her first child with her husband, Uriah. He destroyed that. I mean, you think about forever, Bathsheba's first child was an illegitimate child. Forever. Her first child was an illegitimate child. She had to live with the fact that forever, it was not, hey, mine and Uriah's first child. It wasn't, she couldn't even say mine and David's first child was a legitimate child. She had to say my first child was illegitimate. David didn't have to say that. He had legitimate children. But Bathsheba had to say my first child was an illegitimate child. She also had Uriah. No doubt that she felt like Uriah, because of who he was as one of David's mighty men, he had this opportunity for advancement. And so in her mind, she had this, this built up in her mind of how her life was going to go. And in a moment, David shattered that. In a moment, he shattered that. And so then I want us also to look that David shattered her ability, Brother Croft, to live in peace. He shattered her ability to live in peace. Now, I want you to think about this and think about, now, we live in 2022, and it's pretty much the wild, wild west right now. Everything goes. But you think about back in her day, to commit adultery, I mean, think about it. I mean, back when I was a kid, you would hear a little bit, or you would go into the grocery store, and they had the National Enquirer right there, and you'd see the headlines on the National Enquirer, but you didn't get that much. But nowadays, Brother Parks, I mean, you got it on your phone, and to quote a song. Nowadays, it's who's cheating who, and who's being true, and who don't even care anymore. And that's not a good song. Don't look it up. But anyway, you understand what I'm saying? I mean, we live in 2022 where people don't even think twice about it. They don't even think twice about, I mean, yeah, it'll make news. It'll make some news, but people don't care. But back in her day, I mean, think about this. I mean, she was going to be known as an adulteress. And again, like I said, I mean, they're not understanding, the people of her day were not understanding the whole context. They were not going to be understanding of the whole context. They were not going to be understanding that it was David that was the one who pursued the adultery, not Bathsheba. And they're going to always look at her as she's an adulteress. And so imagine how she couldn't walk down the street, Brother Croft. She could not walk down the street without, every time someone looked at her, if they turned away, whether they were talking about her or not, she had to wonder. They're talking about me. They're talking about me. And think about it. There were some people that she had been friends with. They didn't want anything to do with her anymore. There were people that she was friends with that no longer wanted anything to do with her. And whose fault was that? Was it Bathsheba's fault? It wasn't Bathsheba's fault. It was David's fault. And so she couldn't walk down the street without people seeing people wagging their head and whispering and turning their head because she had committed adultery. And she was known as an adulteress. And again, like I said, the Bible doesn't even call her that. We know that's what happened. We know that's what happened. But God never condemns Bathsheba. But that doesn't mean the people won't condemn her. And so you think about that, but I mean, think about it. And we talked about how many wives and concubines David already had. I mean, can you imagine once he moved her into the palace? Chris, can you imagine once he moved her in, and maybe they all had separate houses or whatever, but whatever. I mean, can you imagine? It's funny sometimes. It's funny sometimes just to see. And I heard someone having a conversation about it. I think this week. But just so happens that a guy and his wife run into an ex-girlfriend, and watching how the wife acted just because he run into an ex-girlfriend. Chris, can you imagine how Bathsheba was treated in the house? Can you imagine how Bathsheba was treated when she was walking around, and all these other wives, all David's other wives, you think she became their newest best friend? Again, I mean, a lot of times women can't get along even if they have no friction. They create friction on their own. But this is not a sibling rivalry. This is a spousal rivalry. And so again, you've got at least 5 or 6 women. You've got 10 concubines, all lobbying for David's attention. And all these other women have been married for a while. They've all got children. They're all lobbying for David's attention. And here's this new kid on the block. And she didn't come by it legitimately. He didn't marry her legitimately. And then they're like, hey, wait a second. Like, they just got married, and she's already got a baby bump here. How is it that they just got married and she's already got a baby bump here? And so no doubt, all the talking behind her back, the people who at one point talked to her but won't talk to her anymore, she had to deal with all of that, and it was not her fault. No doubt, someone would have said, "Hey, maybe she was a co-conspirator," and maybe they didn't use that term, but maybe she was a co-conspirator in her husband's death. Maybe it wasn't David's idea. Maybe it was Bathsheba's idea. You start getting accused of stuff, and you're like, where did that even come from? But all somebody has to do is say it, Gil. All they have to do is just say, hey, and people will run with it. And people that you trust, people that you thought were your friends, sometimes they'll believe something about you without ever just coming to you and say, hey, they said this about you. Is it true? I mean, and just asking someone, hey, this was said about you. I mean, honestly, if you're a real friend, that would go a long way. And they may get upset and say, oh, I can't believe you'd even think that of me. I'm like, look, I'm not. I don't think that about you. But I want you to understand this is what's being said about you, and I'm going to come to your face and ask you face to face if this is true. And if you tell me no, then we're good, and we'll move on. But people no doubt could have thought that she was a co-conspirator in her husband's death. And again, like I said, we live in a day and age. Did they think that because of her beauty, that she used her beauty to advance herself to a place that Uriah could not take her? Again, these are all things that could have been said. You understand what I'm saying, Brother Parks? Here's a woman that said, hey, I'm just married to one of David's mighty men, but he's not ever going to be anything more than David's mighty man. But I could be married to the king. I've noticed the king is looking at me. I've noticed, and again, like I said, I listened. It's been many months ago, but when I was pondering on teaching on this, and I turned my radio on one day, and a guy was teaching on it, and he was teaching in that direction, that it was all Bathsheba. She saw that David was looking at her. She knew that he would be up there looking at her, and she made sure that he saw him. And I don't believe that a bit. I don't think the Bible teaches that. But that doesn't keep people from saying it. That doesn't keep people from saying it. That doesn't keep people from saying, hey, maybe she realized Uriah couldn't take her very far, and she was a gold digger. She was a gold digger and wanted to move on and say, hey, look, I can get rid of Uriah and move on to David and be the king's wife. And none of that was her fault. None of that was her fault. But she had to live with those words being said about her. What's she going to say, Brother Parks? What's she going to say, Jake? What's she going to say? I mean, how's she going to defend herself? How do you defend yourself? How do you say, I'm the innocent one, and David, who's a man after God's own heart, that no one had ever saw anything evil out of, how does she defend herself and say, actually, I was the innocent one, he was the bad one? Because now she's married to him. Again, think about it. Now she's married to him, and now she can't say, hey, David was the bad one, because she's married to him. She doesn't, and so she can't defend herself. She can't say, well, it was David. She just has to take it. So she just had to take it. And one other thing, that because of David, she must forever live with the death of that child. She's got to live with that. She's got to live with that. Again, like I said, forever. She has to live with the death of a child. But I want you to notice now in 2 Samuel 12, verse number 24. In verse number 24, and I'm sorry I went through all the preliminary stuff, but this is where I believe that David and Bathsheba's relationship changed. Now, again, they've already had a child. They've already been married. They've been married for many months. They've already lost a child. And if y'all remember, I actually stopped when I was teaching in verse number 23. But in verse number 24, look at this. It says, and David comforted Bathsheba. I believe that for the first time in David and Bathsheba's marriage, in their relationship, this was the first time that David ever truly showed Bathsheba love the way God intended a man and his spouse to be loved. I think this is the first time. Why? Because David is finally right with God. We know that David got right with God. We went through Psalm 51. We went through all those verses. But David is now fully right with God, and he acknowledges his sin, and he acknowledges his sin towards God, but he also understands that there is this woman here that he's caused all of this heartache that we just went through. He's caused all of this heartache that came to Bathsheba. That was David's fault. And I believe right here when it says David comforted Bathsheba, now we know in the context he's comforting her because the child died. But he's going to have to just basically, just like you get right with God, he's going to have to get right with Bathsheba. He's going to have to get right with Bathsheba. And again, how do you get right with God? You say, hey, it was me. It was me. It was my fault. I did it. It's my sin. I'm the one who did it. It was in my heart, and I'm the one who did it. I confess to you I did it. I'm sorry that I did it. I wish I hadn't done it, but I've done it, and I'm sorry. Please forgive me. I think at this point, David, when he comforts Bathsheba, he's not just comforting her saying, it'll be okay, it'll be fine. He's acknowledging his part. This is my fault. This was not your fault. You didn't have anything to do with this except you were the woman I chose. But now I love you and I want things to be different from this point on. And so right here in verse number 24, their relationship changes, Chris. At the beginning of the relationship, it was just lust on David's part. And honestly, I believe whenever he in verse number 27 of the previous chapter, when he fetched her, I think she married him, but it wasn't because she loved him. It wasn't because she loved him. What else was she going to do? I mean, what else could she do? Again, she's an adulterer. I mean, what other man is going to want? What other man is going to, want to take up her cause and say, "Hey, she's got an illegitimate child and she's had her husband killed." I mean, what other man's going to take up her cause? So she marries David, and he didn't show her love when he married her. He said, "Well, tell me when she's done crying, and as soon as she's done crying, go get her and tell her she's now my wife." He fetched her. And so then for however many months while she carried that child, no doubt that relationship was not great. And then she has the child, and immediately the child's sick. And so again, there was no time for them to build a right relationship, a husband and wife, a relationship a husband and wife should have. But in verse number 24, it says, "And David comforted Bathsheba, his wife." Now you notice, if you remember, whenever we were studying before, what was it? God always said, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. The wife of Uriah the Hittite. But now that David had gotten right with God, God did not refer to Bathsheba as the wife of Uriah the Hittite. He referred to Bathsheba as David's wife. And so even God, in just that subtle little terminology right there, is acknowledging we're not going to talk about it anymore. We're not going to talk about it anymore. It's over with. It's over with. We're done, and we're going to move on. But understand, it's easy to say, hey, we're going to move on. It's easy for me to tell my wife, hey, it's over with. We're not talking about it anymore. We're going to move on. But just like I talked about that trash can, Chris, if it always sits in the trash can, the first time you have a problem, guess what? It gets pulled back out of the trash can and thrown in your face. And so the only way to move on is you have to empty that trash can. You have to empty that trash can. You have to empty it. And so Bathsheba, the beauty of Bathsheba was she allowed herself to be comforted. She allowed herself to be comforted. Again, like I said, a lot of people, you do them wrong one time and you're not getting a second chance. You do them wrong one time and you're not getting a second chance. You do them wrong as many times as David had done Bathsheba wrong. As many times, and just in this short, in this short time period, we're not even talking about a year. We're not even talking about a year. But in all the things that David had done to Bathsheba, and you know what she did? She forgave him. She forgave him. And she moved on. And so if you look right here, it says, "And David comforted Bathsheba's wife and went in unto her and lay with her, and she bare a son. And he called his name Solomon, and the Lord loved him." And so again, like you said, we didn't even know the name of the first child. We We don't even know the name of the first child. It was not even, as far as we know, I mean, I would assume it was given a name, but we don't even see, we never even hear about a name. But here, their relationship had moved on enough so that, let me find it right here. In 1 Chronicles chapter number 22. 1 Chronicles chapter number 22, we're going to show you something right here. In verse number 6 of 1 Chronicles 22, I'm in 2 Chronicles, sorry. In this passage right here, we have David talking to Solomon, and in verse number 6, he says, "Then he called for Solomon his son, and charged him to build a house for the Lord God of Israel. And David said to Solomon, My son, as for me, it was in my mind to build a house under the name of the Lord my God. But the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Thou hast shed blood abundantly, and hast made great wars. Thou shalt not build an house unto my name, because thou hast shed much blood upon the earth in my sight." Now, if y'all remember, we looked at that right there. If you remember, that's the first time that we see where whenever David and Nathan have their conversation. And David talks to Nathan, and Nathan tells David, you go ahead and do what's in your heart. And then Nathan has to come back to David the next day and say, hey, wait a second, sorry I said what I said. I shouldn't have said it, because God told me you cannot build a house. God told me you can't build a house, but one of your son is going to build the house, but you can't build the house. So if you remember that, that's pre-Bathsheba. That's pre-Bathsheba. But look at what happens right here. He says in verse number 9, "Behold, a son shall be born to thee, who shall be a man of rest, and I will give him rest from all his enemies round about, for his name shall be Solomon. And I will give peace and quietness unto Israel in his days. He shall build a house for my name, and he shall be my son, and I will be his father, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom over Israel forever." I'm going to stop reading right there. Now, understand what happened right there. God told David, before he ever committed adultery with Bathsheba, before he ever knowing about Bathsheba, before he ever even knew that he was going to have a son with Bathsheba, that God was going to give him a son. And no doubt it was not one of his sons he already had, but again, he had all his wives and concubines. It could have been any one of those. But David was going to put the name on a son who God was going to anoint to be king. And God chose Solomon as the name, and the name of the first legitimate child that David and Bathsheba had, it says right there in verse 24, she bare a son, and he called his name Solomon. So here is David, and even though he's known that one day he's going to have a son, and that son's name is going to be Solomon, that's going to take the throne, David and Bathsheba's relationship has been restored. And think about it, you just don't have a son. I mean, there's a 9-month period right there where that relationship had to be right. That relationship had to be right. He had to know that him and Bathsheba were now on the same team. It was not like before. They were now on the same team. They had the same heart. They had the same desire. They had the same goals. And because of that, David saw that in Bathsheba. He saw that he was forgiven. He saw that he was forgiven. He saw that we're not going to talk about it anymore. We've moved on, and that's in our past, and we're not going to talk about it anymore. But because of that, whenever he had a son, a legitimate son with Bathsheba, he said, we're going to call his name Solomon. And all the while knowing, and if you look in First Kings chapter number 1, 1 Kings chapter number 1, we're going to get back to this, but in verse number 17, it says, and she said, now again, this is just quick context here. This is when Adonijah, David's son, tried to take over the throne, and Nathan goes to Bathsheba and says, hey, you realize that Adonijah is trying to take over the throne. We need to do something about this, so this is what we're going to do. We're going to look at this later more in depth. But look, in verse number 17, and it says, and she said unto him, my Lord, thou swearest by the Lord thy God unto thine handmaid, saying, assuredly Solomon thy son shall reign after me. And so, again, David told Bathsheba a long time ago, and the Bible doesn't tell us exactly how old Solomon was, but he's probably in the age of 20 to 25 years old whenever he takes over. But so 20 years in the past, David told Bathsheba, hey, we're going to name this child Solomon, and he is going to be the one. I've got all these other kids. At this time, he's got Amnon, he's got Absalom, he's got Adonijah. He's got all these other kids by all these other wives. But David tells Bathsheba, it's going to be Solomon. He's the one that's going to take over. And look at what God does. In verse number 25, let me finish in verse number 24. And called his name Solomon, and the Lord loved him. And we know, and again, we know that God can love someone's illegitimate child just as much as he can love a legitimate child. We understand all that. We understand that God doesn't blame the child. God doesn't blame the child. We understand that. But it says the Lord loved him, and he sent by the hand of Nathan the prophet, and he called his name Jedediah because of the Lord. And so Jedediah means beloved of Jehovah. So God looked down, and again, like I said, God forgave David. And David got right, and he got fully right, and God forgave David. But not only did God forgive David, Bathsheba forgave David. And because of that, God blessed them with a child. And again, like I said, it's not ideal how they ended up together, but because they are together now, and David got right, and Bathsheba forgave David, God blessed them with a child, and God blessed them with a Solomon. Solomon meaning peace. But God blessed them with Solomon, and then Nathan the prophet was able to go to them, and no doubt, and I'll get to it probably next week, but no doubt, Bathsheba probably wasn't necessarily thrilled to see Nathan, because the last time Nathan came along, when she had a child, he said, your child's going to die. But this time Nathan comes along, and no doubt there was a little bit of fear that wells up in her heart, thinking, oh no, not again. But instead of saying, hey, your child's going to die, this time he says, hey, y'all call him Solomon, and I understand, but God says, hey, we're going to call him Jedediah because he's beloved of the Lord. He's beloved of Jehovah. I love this child, and I'm not upset with y'all anymore. And again, David knew that, and David understood that, and Bathsheba had forgiven David, but until this point, she really doesn't know for sure, whether God is going to bless her with another child. If you've ever lost a child, my wife lost a child. If you ever lost a child, you're very nervous the next time you get pregnant, thinking, what happens if I lose another child? And so David and Bathsheba got their relationship right in verse 24 when David comforted Bathsheba. And then because their relationship was right, God blessed them with a child, and God blessed them not just with any child, but God blessed them with Solomon. And so if you have your Bible now, if you turn over to Proverbs chapter number 1, I want us to also consider the raising of Solomon, Miss Jimmy. The raising of Solomon, there was a difference. David had many wives. He had many wives, and he raised sons. And I didn't read it in 1 Kings chapter number 1 right there. But in verse number 6, it's talking about Adonijah. It says, and his father had not displeased him at any time in saying, why hast thou done so? And so again, there was a difference in the raising of Solomon than the raising of David's other children. There was a difference. And what was the difference? The difference was Bathsheba. The difference was Bathsheba. Bathsheba at one point in time, when David was not right with God, brought out the worst in David. But once David got right with God and David and Bathsheba's relationship was right, Bathsheba brought out the best in David. So in Proverbs chapter number 1, verse number 8, he says, "My son, hear the instruction of thy father, and forsake not the law of thy mother." And so here you have, and again, I know this is Proverbs, and this may not always be David talking to Solomon, but it may be Solomon talking to his son. I understand that. But Solomon had to learn these things somewhere. Solomon had to learn these things somewhere. And so we're going to see where he learned them from in chapter 4, verse number 13. And I thought about using this for something else. But in chapter 4, verse number 3, it says, "For I was my father's son, tender and only beloved in the sight of my mother. He taught me also and said unto me, Let thine heart retain my words, keep my commandments, and live." And so here is David. Now, I just read you in 1 Kings where David, when talking about Adonijah, David never told him no. David never told him no. But with Solomon, from the time Solomon was a little child, David took his time, and Bathsheba took her time. They took their time and co-parented Solomon. And you think about, all these other kids, again, like I said, when you have multiple wives, how are you going to co-parent? How are you going to co-parent whenever you got this one and her family, and 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 those other kids probably did not receive the attention that Solomon received. But because of David and with Bathsheba, they co-parented. They agreed. He said right there, he said about that, he said, "Forsake not my commandment." In verse number 8, "My son, hear the instruction of thy father, and forsake not the law of thy mother." In another place, he's going to talk about the commandment and the law. Well, what is he saying right there? The parents were agreeing. They were agreeing with each other. It was not, hey, mom says this and dad says this. When I was a kid, my mom said no all the time, but if I asked dad, he would say yes. So I learned not to ever ask my mom first. I always just asked my dad, because my dad would let me do stuff my mom, I knew, would say no. I knew she'd say no. And you see that a lot. You see where kids play their parents against each other. They play their parents against each other. Even from a small child, they learn to manipulate their parents. And Solomon said, "Didn't happen in my house." Solomon said, "Didn't happen in my house. My father said this is a commandment. My mom said that's the law. Deal with it." And so in chapter 6, verse number 20, "My son, keep thy father's commandment." There it is, sorry. "My son, keep thy father's commandment, and forsake not the law of thy mother." That's what I was talking about. He says, "Bind them continually upon thine heart, and tie them about thy neck. When thou goest, it shall lead thee, and when thou sleepest, it shall keep thee. When thou awakest, it shall talk with thee. For the commandment is a lamp, and the law is light, and reproofs of instruction are the way of life." He said, look, I'm just telling you. Me and your mom agree, and not only do we agree, but you're going to be wrong, and when you're wrong, we're going to have to reprove you, and when we reprove you, I don't know if y'all noticed, but the R's are killing me this morning. But when I reprove you, that I'm going, it's not because I hate you, it's because I love you, and it's instruction, it's just part of life. And so he showed them over and over how that the parents, David and Bathsheba, after they got over, after David comforted her, they got over. Again, we don't read a whole lot about the relationship, but we can read here in Proverbs as Solomon is talking about what he learned as a child, that we learned that David and Bathsheba co-parented them. It was not, your dad says this, but he's of this and he's of that. We've all seen it. We've all seen it where the husband and the wife are constantly at odds at each other. And they're constantly bickering back and forth. And they're constantly fighting. And then they drag the kids in. And then they try and get the kids to take sides. And they try to use the kids against each other. That was not David and Bathsheba. Could have been. Could have been. Easily could have been. But that was not David and Bathsheba. In chapter number 31. Chapter number 31, and I'll be done right here quick. The words of King Lemuel, the prophecy that his mother taught him. What my son, and what the son of my womb, and what the son of my vows. Give not thy strength unto women, nor thy ways to that which destroyeth kings. It is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes strong drink, lest they drink and forget the law, and pervert the judgment of any of the afflicted. I'll stop reading right there. But here's Bathsheba, and again, she didn't say, don't be like your father. Don't be like your father. I mean, again, we've all heard it. We've all seen people. We've all seen marriages that are shattered because they never empty the trash can, and the trash can's always full, and it's always overflowing, and it's always being thrown back up in someone's face. Bathsheba didn't say that. She just said, look, this is how you need to act. She didn't even bring it up. She didn't bring it up. She said, this is how you need to act. You need to act like a man. You need to act right. You need to act intelligently. You don't need to use strong drink. If you use strong drink, it's going to cloud your judgment. Once it clouds your judgment, you're going to do things you wish you hadn't done and you don't want to do. And so here is Bathsheba teaching Solomon. She's teaching him, but she's not beating up her husband in an effort to teach Solomon. She's just teaching him right. And so the beauty of Bathsheba was she forgave David. She forgave David. And because she fully forgave David, and because she was able to move on from that, she was able to raise a Solomon. And raise a Solomon who God loved and God blessed. But it's because Bathsheba was able to forgive and forget. Thank you.